So Mariah, I'm seeing the same thing we saw before you went silent. Tim and I are up on the screen and the agenda.
Okay, sounds good.
Shall we start right at 11, or do we give people a minute or two?
Well, there's only 43 on yet,
Okay.
according to the attendance line. We should give
Oh,
it a
yeah.
little more time.
With any luck, the cat will not climb on my head as she did during yesterday's phone call. Good morning, everyone. It's 11:01, and we're still seeing people joining in. So we're just going to be silent for another moment or two, give people an opportunity to work with technology and get onto the meeting. All right, I think we're going to start so that we are mindful and respectful of people's time. People will join, I'm sure, as we continue. Thank you for being part of Restore the Delta's webinar on current Delta processes, with an emphasis this morning on the voluntary agreements. First off, we really hope that you all out there are doing okay, that you and your families are well, physically and in terms of your spirits during the pandemic. Over 150 people have registered today, and we thank you for that. And we want to make note and welcome the several dozen people joining from the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife, Aqua, and various water districts. We're happy to have you hear our concerns regarding planning processes for the health of the estuary. We also want to make note that the majority of today's participants are sadly not Delta residents, either from the farming community, business community, workers, or the environmental justice community. There are several reasons for this, which I'll explain momentarily. Today, we will give a quick update on planning processes. Tim Stroshane has prepared a well-detailed outline of the history of water planning that has led to the voluntary agreements. I will summarize his presentation with some comments, and then we'll take questions that you can type into the webinar screen. Mariah Looney will moderate the questions during the question and answer period. We also want to announce that our tentative date for our next webinar is April 23rd. We have limited staff during this time period. Every one of our staff members has been touched with family challenges during the pandemic. And so we just have to make sure people have the time they need to take care of their families first. So starting today, I want to give a quick update on the notice of preparation for the Delta Tunnels, or Delta Tunnel. Those comments regarding the scoping document are still due April 17th, despite our comments to DWR regarding the suspension of all public processes regarding the tunnel during the pandemic. If you are in a position to make comments, it is more important than ever that you do so, and to remind DWR that there are people who are left out of the process during this time. Who's left out? Those who are impacted by the digital divide, essential workers in the Delta. We have a large number of essential workers in the Delta, environmental justice communities, Northern California tribes, people caring for the sick, and those struggling financially. While it's not good practice to speak for other communities that should be given the opportunity to represent themselves, it is important to point out who has been left out of the process presently, and to point out what their concerns may be. We have struggling Delta communities presently during COVID. There are COVID cases and a lack of food for farm workers in Ileton. We understand, we learned last night. We've sent word to the Delta Protection Commission about that to see how we can get assistance there. And while the urban Delta has a very large number of essential workers, with our biggest employers being agriculture, food-related industries, and county government, so people are really stressed with working and all the limitations involved with doing things properly during the pandemic. Farm operations in the Delta are greatly impacted with needed COVID protections. We really feel for farmers who will be going into fruit harvest shortly. Our rural communities do not have internet access that's adequate due to lack of reliable service. And our urban Delta communities also face connectivity issues due to affordability and a lack of access to devices. So we want people to remember when they're making comments, because if you've made it into this call, you are the percentage of the population that is doing better during the pandemic. So we want to remind you that right now we need you to represent those who cannot represent themselves in a robust way that we would like to see. And so we call on you to make sure that you do comments that remember those who cannot participate presently. To see Restore the Delta's comment letter, if you look, my notes have a summary that's up here for the webinar. There's a link there to click for Restore the Delta's comment letter that we did turn in for the initial date in March. And there's also a click there to look for the notice of preparation and where to send your comments when you complete them by April 17th. This is probably the last you'll hear from us in a webinar kind of situation before that deadline, because we won't be back doing this until April 23rd, roughly. Restore the Delta is also a member of the Stakeholders Engagement Committee for the Design Construction Authority for the tunnel project. And we joined that committee because we felt that we had a duty to ensure that impacts are minimized for Delta communities should we not prevail in redirecting and stopping the project. While we cannot respond, we can respond to current work activities that have been assigned to us with our observations, we cannot broadly right now communicate with impacted parties in the Delta. Farmers, like I said, are working under difficult conditions, and they don't have time right now for input meetings. EJ communities are struggling with survival, and asking people about water projects presently is often answered with like, why are you asking me this now? So we are kind of distraught that our work won't be as thorough or as complete as it should be. Regarding the SEC process and the NOP process, we're still asking people who are sheltering in place to have time and the ability to drop an email to DWR Director Carla Nemeth and Secretary Crowfoot asking them to suspend public processes around the tunnel. If they really want to end the old binaries, then we have to take the whole community with us. They can either go fast or they can go slow, and we can all go together. So if you would like to help us with that, and in this document that we have uploaded for the webinar, you'll find a place to click for that information about how to reach them and to share your comments about suspending public processes. There are several other state and federal processes that are ripe or ripening for litigation, and we are prepared to litigate in those areas. And that's all I'm going to say on that matter. You'll see our emails and our alerts as they unfold. So that brings us now to Tim Stroshane's presentation for the history of the voluntary agreements. And again, if you have questions, just type them in. We will answer questions at the end, and we hope you are well. Thank you.
Oh, show my screen. I'm trying to get there. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet, Tim. Feel free to call out for help to Mariah.
Yeah, Mariah, I need some help.
So Tim, make sure that on the sharing under control panel, you click under show, you click the screen that you are using,
Okay, just
or
a
the
minute.
window that you are using.
Okay, there's my cursor. It was with the slideshow up. I was so show my screen. Does that show it?
Yes.
I see it.
Hey, all right. I'm Tim Stroshane, policy analyst with Restore the Delta. We're glad you can join us for this presentation and discussion of Delta water quality and the proposed voluntary agreements associated with the State Water Board's efforts to amend the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. We're making this slide presentation and more detailed notes that I've written available to all who are interested in downloading them for review and further study. And they're shown, I believe you probably can see them on your screen, perhaps. I hope so. And with that, I'll get to the outline. I'll briefly introduce you to Central Valley and Delta hydrology and water quality. Then I'll touch on the structure of water quality control plans before getting to flow and water quality issues in the Delta. Finally, I will summarize key moments in Delta water quality planning over the last quarter century, culminating with the process to amend the Bay Delta Plan at the Water Board using voluntary agreements now in negotiation. Just quickly, I want to review how California gets or does not get its water. We get storms either from the tropics originating near Hawaii or we get them from a region of the northern Pacific Ocean near Alaska. The tropical storms tend to be wetter and warmer, while the North Pacific storms tend to be cooler and drier. Droughts occur for us when a ridge of high pressure shifts the storm track away from us, either to the north or to the south. The water that gets here goes into snowpack, rivers, and aquifers when it reaches California. But it also is captured by gigantic water systems that divert water largely from northern to southern California. In the Sacramento River Basin, most reservoirs are developed for local use, but three major reservoirs store and deliver water associated with the federal Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. These major reservoirs and dams of the CVP and SWP are Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom. The major tributaries to the Sacramento are the Feather, Yuba, Bear, and American rivers. The Sacramento and Feather rivers are the major natural conveyance systems for both the CVP and the SWP. The Sacramento Valley has two major basins, the San Joaquin River Basin and the Tulare Lake Basin. Only the San Joaquin Basin actually drains naturally to the Delta and San Francisco Bay. Only on severe flood occasions will the Tulare Lake Basin discharge to the San Joaquin Basin and thence to the Bay. The San Joaquin Basin's major tributaries include the Stanislaus, the Tuolumne, the Merced, and the Upper San Joaquin rivers. Major water facilities include Millerton Lake and Friant Kern Canal of the CVP, and jointly operated facilities San Luis Reservoir and the part of the California Aqueduct with the San Luis Canal. There are two major areas of the Delta where permanent CVP and SWP facilities operate. First is the Delta Cross Channel near Walnut Grove, shown here in the orange box, and the South Delta pumping plants, Banks of the State Water Project and Jones of the CVP. Both pumping plants get their water directly from Old River. These facilities are in the black box at the bottom next to the inset. The SWP and CVP place the Delta at the center of their systems. In fact, the Delta is also the site of several east to west transfers, not just north to south. By my count, there are 9 projects that divert water from the Delta. The users shown in bold here account for most of the volume of water diverted for export from the Delta by the SWP and the CVP to San Joaquin Valley, Silicon Valley, and Southern California water customers. The average annual exports by these three sources is about 5.3 million acre feet. An acre foot is a unit of measure equivalent to covering an acre of land, like a football field, with water 1 foot deep. It's about 326,000 gallons, or about the amount of water 2 families in California use in a year. I want to shift gears to water quality control planning now. There are 3 components to a water quality control plan: beneficial uses, water quality objectives that are to protect the beneficial uses, and a program of implementation. The Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan has 3 broad beneficial uses to which the State Water Board regulates: municipal/industrial, agriculture, and fish and wildlife. By regulating to the needs of these uses, the board believes its water quality objectives also protect many other beneficial uses, including recreation, groundwater recharge, rare and endangered species, and estuarine uses, such as the reproductive needs of resident fish and the food webs of the estuary. Water quality criteria are especially important because the levels at which they are set dictate how much fresh river inflow and delta outflow are put toward protecting in-delta beneficial uses as compared with how much of those flows can be exported by the CVP and SWP to customers beyond the delta. This slide shows effects of all the diversions on natural or unimpaired flows as compared with actual flows to the delta. The diversions substantially reduce the absolute amounts of flow into the delta each year. The colors of the chart signify the relative dryness of the flows. In the lower chart, they show that the actual flows represent a condition of nearly permanent drought in the form of black and red bars reflecting supercritical and critical flow years, especially since about 1987. Having seen large amounts of its water exported by the two big water systems for over 40 years now, the delta has suffered water quality and ecological degradation. The pumps in the South Delta reverse flows along Old and Middle River, and their suction force is just that strong. These upstream flows confuse young fish and cause South Delta farmers problems with pumping for their water supplies and for their water quality for crops. Young fish get trapped in Clifton Court Forebay, where predators easily eat them. The consequences of the Delta's troubled waters include the Federal Endangered Species Act listing of 4 different native fishes: Delta smelt, Central Valley steelhead trout, and 2 runs of Chinook salmon, the winter and spring runs. Going into the mid-1990s, California's water industry had been buffeted by drought, financial crisis, and then ESA listings. They were very worried about whether their total contract water supply amounts could ever become reality. Between October and December 1994, state, federal, and regional water agencies and some environmental groups hammered out details of a Bay Delta Accord to be submitted to the Water Board for its consideration in 1995. Unfortunately, the Bay Delta Accord process excluded Delta residents and farmers from discussions. The Bay Delta Accord established new water quality objectives that had not existed in prior adopted water quality plans from 1978 and 1991. In effect, the Bay Delta Accord became the 1995 Water Quality Plan objectives for fish and wildlife beneficial uses. The new plan addressed them in several ways. It provided net delta outflow objectives, pulse and transport flows to stimulate migration of young salmon to the ocean, and the new X2 estuarine habitat objective. The plan added a new export to inflow ratio objective to help reduce entrainment of various small fish life stages at or near the pumps. To avoid diversion of fish into central delta channels where predation is higher, and also to avoid entrainment of fish at the South Delta pumps, the plan added seasonal opening and closure of the Delta Cross Channel near Walnut Grove. And its program of implementation included numerous other non-flow implementation measures: fish screens at the pumps, angling restrictions, delta barriers, control of invasive plant and other species, and a proposed habitat mitigation fund. Voluntary agreements were not included in the 1995 plan. Between 1995 and 2000, California entered a very wet period in which project allocations were high and there were no drought years. Water Right Decision D-1641 was also part of the 1995 plan's program of implementation, since the Water Board is authorized to regulate water rights. D-1641 placed 3 conditions on water right permits of the CVP and SWP. First were the 1995 Bay Delta Plan and Delta Accord policies that I just mentioned. Second, D-1641 also added joint point of diversion and consolidated place of use provisions to give the CVP and SWP more options to move water flexibly, so long as the projects coordinated the accounting of who got what water when. D-1641 also incorporated a newly negotiated and voluntary San Joaquin River Agreement, in which an adaptive management experiment on salmon migration and biology would be conducted for 12 years in lieu of meeting the Fernales San Joaquin River flow objective of the 1995 plan. The board agreed. The Fernales Adaptive Management Plan ultimately failed to meet expectations. The science work done was helpful and interesting, but ultimately inconclusive for 2 main reasons. First, the water gods did not provide a sequence of water years varied enough to be meaningful for further adaptive management purposes. Second, what flows were provided were not enough to make meaningful pulses for the fish to take advantage of as they headed to sea. This part of D-1641 was litigated immediately in 2000. The 2006 Roby decision found that the Water Board violated clean water laws when it allowed the San Joaquin River Agreement and its VAMP experiment to go forward within D-1641, but without having provided in the 1995 plan that negotiated agreements in lieu of meeting flow objectives could be used as an alternative for Fernales flow compliance. The Water Board took the Roby decision to heart and is now calling for voluntary agreements for the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins as among the amendments to the Water Quality Plan in the Delta. So far, none have been concluded. This chart shows how state and federal water exports south of the Delta responded when the Bay Delta Accord took effect with approval of D-1641 in 2000. D-1641 was a boon to the projects in wetter years from 2000 to 2007, and again in 2011 when conditions were very wet. The declines in exports in 2008, 2009, and from 2012 through 2015 were due primarily to drought. Water quality and ecological problems also worsened after 2000 under the regime of the Bay Delta Accord and D-1641. By 2005, many fish and other species populations were crashing in the Delta. And by 2009, harmful algal blooms had emerged as a new ecological and water quality stressor in the Delta and other water bodies throughout California. The 2018 Phase 1 amendments to the Bay Delta Plan, begun in 2009, were delayed by 2 droughts and the California Water Fix Project water right hearings, 2015 through 2018. But when they got to it, first, the Water Board amended the 1995 plan to provide a new flow objective ranging from 30 to 50% of unimpaired flow, not only on the San Joaquin River itself, but on its major tributaries, the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers. The board adopted a starting point of 40% of unimpaired flow, which was the midpoint of the range. These target flows are higher than actual flows on the tributaries prior to their adoption. Their season of use is from February 1st through June 30th each year now. While Restore the Delta and other environmental water advocates wanted to see still higher flows, we felt ultimately the board's action was at least better than the earlier status quo. Next, the Water Board potentially increased allowable salinity for agriculture in the South Delta by adopting a single year-round salinity objective within the interior South Delta along Old, Middle, and Main Stem San Joaquin rivers. The board did so, believing that expected February through June flow increases will also help protect farmers' irrigation supplies in the South Delta. Finally, Phase 1 San Joaquin flow amendments also encourage voluntary agreements, provided they demonstrate that flows in all tributaries meet the unimpaired flow range that the board adopted in December 2018. The board intends to use voluntary agreements with Phase 2 Sacramento River flow objective amendments, except that they haven't formally adopted Sacramento River flow and related operational objectives. They have floated the idea of an unimpaired flow range of 45 to 65% of unimpaired flows for the Sacramento, Feather, Yuba, Bear, and American rivers. The suggested starting point they would regulate to is 55% of unimpaired flows. The season for these are not yet known. The Water Board's 2018 Sacramento Basin Framework document excluded mention. The 2010 Delta Flow Criteria report, however, which described informational flow objectives to help fish species in the Delta, called for a season of November through June. A February 2020 announcement of a framework for voluntary agreements, shown here in the following blue slides, suggests a lack of transparency about how successful VA negotiations are right now. It has been 14 months since the Phase 1 San Joaquin amendments were adopted, and going on a year since the board indicated it would consider its Phase 2 Sacramento flow amendments. The February rollout left many unanswered questions. For example, this new VA framework fails to indicate whether the 800 to 900,000 acre-feet of proposed new flows, in fact, fall within the board's desired unimpaired flow range. This makes it hard to draw meaningful comparisons. It fails to indicate how much of the 60,000 acres of new habitat are already contained in California Eco Restore or other habitat conservation plans for the Valley and Delta. The legislated salmon doubling goal has been with us since 1988. It calls for doubling the annual average populations of salmon and steelhead over the 1967 to 1991 average populations. The VA framework may seek to set a new baseline. Perhaps the negotiators believe that the old salmon doubling goal is now impossible to achieve. The February presentation was hazy about this. Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot referred to the VA's anticipated investments in science and adaptive management as the secret sauce for success of the VAs. But is it secret sauce or just applying science-based trial and error? Unfortunately, error could mean extinction for one or more of the listed fish species. The framework's current description of these adaptive management investments is no more specific than were those of California WaterFix at the time of that project's water right hearings. That project's secret sauce was so secret it was nearly non-existent. The cost estimate for the VA framework suggests other ways in which VA negotiators are less than forthcoming. First, what is voluntary paid fallowing? It may be a program to pay farmers not to plant crops and forego irrigating. In theory, that would free up water for meeting VA flows. How will that be organized? if farmers already get paid not to grow crops through USDA programs, will they still be eligible to be paid for water they would not have used anyway? In other words, will the VAs encourage double dipping for taxpayer subsidies by wealthy water right holders just because they hold senior water rights? Second, there appears to be a $1.2 billion fund for water purchases for unspecified uses from unspecified sellers. Again, probably senior water right holders. The VA framework gives every impression of being water welfare for the rich. Third, new water projects and programs also are not itemized in the framework, but will cost $1.6 billion. Is that Shasta Rays, Sites Reservoir, a down payment on a Delta conveyance project, or all of the above? The VA framework implementation slide does not bother to state whether the State Water Board will use its legal authority to enforce VA flows, because they have not adopted flow objectives for a range within which the VA flows would have to conform. State officials also omitted that to finalize the VAs means submitting them to a water board process in which we, the public, will learn whether water board or VA negotiated flows drive the process and in whose interests they will be adopted. One water board member told us last Friday that the VAs would be considered as an alternative to the board's proposals for flow objectives, whatever they will be. We were also told that the board's process may not get going for another 18 to 24 months. The San Joaquin River Agreement experience does not inspire confidence that the outcome of these VAs will truly improve things for fish and protect humans from noxious waters in the Delta, including flows for harmful algal bloom prevention and mitigation. There's still many more questions we have about the substance and process of the VAs. What will be their relationships to other elements of the California water picture at this point? And that water picture, of course, includes things like the new incidental take permit for the State Water Project, the proposed Delta Conveyance Project, upstream storage projects such as Shasta Rays or Sites, this year's potential opening of a water market for transfers to cope with dry conditions. The eco-restore activities that I mentioned, do they overlap or are they new projects contained in the VAs? What's the relationship of the VAs to SGMA implementation and groundwater recovery? And finally, we have questions about the status of the Delta Levy Subventions Program and whether there will be investments in the long run, or are we, and what their relationship might be to the voluntary agreements. What effects will the pandemic and its economic recession have on funding and planning? Will the VA negotiators have taken account of climate change effects on upstream storage, exports, and Delta outflow? What is the risk of the Delta Conveyance Project and new upstream storage projects becoming stranded assets with large debt burdens? So those are some of the questions that we still have, and we're going to move to the next phase here, and I believe Barbara has perhaps a few more remarks before we take questions.
So to kind of summarize how we see things falling out regarding really kind of, I want to say, the politics of the voluntary agreements. You know, we're hearing daily that parties are pushing for reconciliation between the Trump administration's water plan and DWR operations of the State Water Project, and that anything less than that reconciliation will thwart the voluntary agreements. You know, as we've seen today in the news, federal leaders are sending letters and really urging Governor Newsom to take a surrender Dorothy type of action toward water management in California. They're really pushing for an agenda of water exports all the time, regardless of conditions. So if we take a step back from the analysis that Tim just provided, and we reflect on the historical nature of this and what has led to the VAs, it's really clear that the voluntary agreements will be a quote unquote success if they generate even greater exports from our rivers and from the Delta, despite this continuously dwindling water supply. And Delta residents, the people who can't get on this webinar today, the people who are working in the farms and people who are part of our urban economy that works in a food economy, all tied to the health of the estuary, are the people who are going to be left with degraded water quality and a never-ending proliferation of harmful algal blooms, which really has become our primary water quality fear and concern in the Delta, and increased flood threat. The bottom line is the fourth climate change assessment by the state of California is being ignored in state and federal analysis, when it should be the basis for future water planning on the drought side and on the flood side. We need projects outside of the Delta in order to solve our water challenges. And in closing, we've been told repeatedly by Secretary Crowfoot that he got it, that a Delta tunnel could not take more water from the Delta, but would take less. But our question now with the voluntary agreements is less to what? If the goalposts are moved for the voluntary agreements, weakening standards for flows in and out of the Delta, it becomes very easy to facilitate greater volumes of water for transfers through a tunnel. In short, George Miller got it right in his op-ed this past weekend on how California water has to be managed post-COVID. We're asking everyone who's participated today to help us support sustainable water policies. Get the comments in wherever you can. Watch what's happening with the voluntary agreements and processes later on at the Water Board. But especially now during the epidemic, we're calling on you for help so that we can help protect those who cannot advocate for themselves within the Delta presently. And we need to rely on our friends from the outside to help with our communities. So I think now we will turn it over to questions from Mariah.
Hello, everyone. So I will be reading the questions and who has asked it, and either Barbara or Tim will answer. If you have any questions, there is a questions tab, and you can go ahead and just type in whatever you want, and I will be asking. So the first question is from Mary Elizabeth, and it is, so who gets the Folsom South water? Is it a part of the quote dream unquote project or recharge banking?
Well, as I understand Folsom South, it's a project that is jointly owned and operated by, I believe it's the Sacramento County Water Agency, and others could jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but also with East Bay Municipal Utilities District. And the project was built, I believe, by the Bureau originally, but it is intended, as I understand it, at least for East Bay Mud, it is intended primarily as very much a dry year source of supply. And can you read the question again to me, Mariah?
Yeah, so it's, so who gets the Folsom South water? Is it a part of the DREAM project, in quotes, recharge banking?
I'm not familiar with a quote unquote dream project, but I think I've answered the question as to who receives water from it. It's the Sacramento County Water Agency and the East Bay Municipal Utility District.
Yes.
Okay, the next question comes from Mahesh Maskey, and well, there were two questions. The first one was, what is X2? And then they asked again, what is the literal meaning of X2? And what is the physical meaning in the model?
Yeah, there are people who are on this webinar who probably have a much more detailed understanding of why the estuarine habitat standard was labeled X2. My understanding was that it came kind of just from scientific nomenclature as to where the physical location in the ebb and flow of Suisun Bay and Carquinez Strait played with respect to the level of salinity at approximately 2 parts per 1,000, I believe, which is a level of salinity where habitat conditions are really optimal for a lot of estuary related beneficial uses. So I hope that's helpful. What was the other part of the question? Or the other question?
Give me a second. What is the literal meaning of X2 and what is the physical meaning in the model?
I'm not sure what model the questioner refers to, but
I believe it was on slides 13 and 14.
okay. Oh, I should get that up again for folks to see. Again, it's not clear to me what model is being referred to here. But at any rate, I think I've addressed the nature of what X2 attempts to accomplish. That the estuary is affected by tidal flow from the bay. It's affected by inflow from the various rivers and creeks and streams that enter the delta, and it's the interplay of those competing flows in the delta, one coming upstream and the other coming downstream, as to what the position of X2 is in relation to landforms, such as, is it down by Antioch, or is it down by Chips Island? Is it up by, say, 3 Mile Slough, something like that?
And it really is a marker for salinity in the water. It's a boundary that moves, but it's also a measurement for the level of salinity in the water in that position.
Okay, great. The next question is from C. Mark Rockwell, and it's actually a few questions. So, how will fish be monitored differently within the voluntary agreement? How would changes in the biops for Delta water operations impact Delta outflows? And will Delta outflow levels be mandated at healthy levels?
Those are all great questions, and we have not been privy to the discussions of that.
You have to remember, Delta parties were not invited into the voluntary agreements, into the process. And we're not just talking our organization, we're talking about local counties, water districts, the irrigation districts within the Delta and the surrounding municipal districts. We have all been left out of the process. So we rely on information from people who have an understanding of what's going on and kind of work on our own research. But to an extent for us, it's kind of like feeling a part of the elephant and we're all blindfolded.
Thank you. Cheryl Widens, I'm so sorry if I mispronounced some people's names, asks, will you be providing talking points for comments and where can they be found?
Okay, so if you go to our comment letter and you look at our blogs online, we have talked about what our major concerns are regarding the scope of work and the notice of preparation. If people want to provide input to the tunnel alignments that are proposed, they can always write me at barbara@restorethedelta.org, and I'm happy to review with them with guidance, and give them some guidance. those items we're preparing a response to that we're turning in presently also to the stakeholder committee for the DCA. And that analysis is a little different. It's very, very micro compared to some of the things that we're able to talk about on the webinar. And if people want to work with us individually on responses to that, the best way to do that is to email me and we will give you input. But right now, I would rely on the blogs that we've put out on the letters and to go back and think about what this project means compared to what you learned about the project during water fix. Some things haven't changed. Where the location of the intakes are proposed at the start of the project, that a great level of volume of water will be taken before it moves through the estuary. And so those kind of costs, a 5% inflation rate on the project, a 23-year construction period, those things haven't changed. So, but if people want to delve down and work into further details on construction impacts, they can contact me.
Okay, great. Also on the screen, people should see, this is what the document looks like. It's one of our handouts that has the comment letter and the NOP comments. It's labeled Update on Delta Processes. So that's one of the handouts added. I just wanted to throw that in. Jane Wagner-Tyack asks, well, she says, the Phase 1 flow objectives apply to San Joaquin River tributaries. Please comment on how entities in addition to those tributaries became involved in negotiating VAs.
Well, my understanding is that these entities, to use Jane's term, are largely irrigation districts and perhaps a few mutual water companies and water districts in both the Sacramento and San Joaquin basins. And they, when the opportunity was opened up to by the board in the 2018 amendment process to voluntary agreements, they got busy with it. There was also a point at which Governor Brown, I don't remember the exact year that he wrote this letter to Felicia Marcus, who was board chair at the time, but my recollection is he wrote a letter and said, you know, you really ought to consider putting voluntary agreements into the plan. And Ms. Marcus wrote back very diplomatically and said that eventually, I think it was 2 or 3 months later, she got back to him. And she wrote back saying that the board intended to do that, but they also intended to ensure that whatever negotiated agreements on flows and other provisions were established in the negotiated agreements in the VAs, that they would comply substantially with the flow ranges that the board was considering at that time, which was also the 30 to 50% with the 40% target flow to start. So, Barbara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, we also have to remember that Governor Brown had enlisted the aid of Arizona retired Governor Bruce Babbitt. And he had, even before those letters were sent, Bruce Babbitt out on the trail meeting with water district officials and water right holders throughout the entire state, really trying to put such a plan or a deal together at that time. He had told us when we finally had a meeting with him that he recognized that there was an error made, that flow standards should have been set before trying to move forward with construction of a tunnel. And I think that's where that process really began. And it is an extension of that initial effort from several years ago, 2016, 2017. The years are blurring at the moment, just like the days are.
Okay, thank you. Ronald Beltramo asks, well, he says, please give us specific things that we can do to help with the voluntary settlement agreement process.
The voluntary settlement agreement, if one is reached, will be advanced to the State Water Resources Control Board for consideration. At that time, we will definitely be calling on the public to help us make comments. I think until then, if you're going to send an email off to Director Nemeth and Secretary Crowfoot, asking them to hold off on public processes around the tunnel, you might want to add in your concerns now about the voluntary agreements. That first off, Delta people should be included in the process, but second, they just can't be a system of increasing water exports. And I think you could keep it at that basic of a level. It's hard for us to tell you what you should start commenting on in any more detail because we're not privy to the information, and none of that information has been revealed publicly. We don't like to misstate things at Restore the Delta. We like to see the documents and then respond factually to the documents in hand. Tim, do you have something to add there?
No, but I second that emotion.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. Carol Desa Campos says, going back to the quote, beneficial uses, unquote, municipal / industrial uses, why, or agriculture and fish and wildlife, why is industrial use prioritized over people, agriculture, parentheses, food, and fish and wildlife, also parentheses, food?
If I gave that impression, that was not my intention. The municipal component of municipal and industrial includes drinking water, and so that's definitely a priority for the State Water Board as it regulates salinity, particularly as it regulates salinity conditions in the Delta, especially in the Western Delta, where there are cities like Antioch, Brentwood, Rio Vista, places like that. Their water supplies are a focus of attention in the board's work and in this Bay Delta Plan process. Agriculture is important because it's a key part of the Bay Delta economy. It's a major factor in the employment base of the region. It feeds other industries such as food processing and transportation, wholesale trade, retail trade. So it's a significant component of the economy. It's not strictly just farmers using water. The water goes into crops that feed into a system of exchange and trade and consumption. So that's not insubstantial. And it could even be argued that from the South Delta farmers' standpoint that agriculture has been not privileged in the setting of flow objectives, because they argued, and this is discussed to some extent in a couple of footnotes in the notes that are provided with this webinar, the Stroshane notes that are included as a download item. There was controversy between South Delta and the State Water Board about whether their study of salinity conditions in the South Delta was really valid or not. Yet the State Water Board and the State Water Board wanted to establish a new year-round objective rather than a seasonal objective for salinity that was less protective of the irrigation water quality of Delta farmers.
So, and to build on that, your municipal water use goes for drinking water, and also what's considered one of the highest priorities in our system is water for basic sanitation. And of course, right now, that is a priority. That's why the governor wisely pushed through the, excuse me, water shutoff moratorium. Water for sanitation and drinking water really are the highest priorities of how we use water. And in terms of agriculture, you know, the Delta has a history of creating fewer crops for export and more crops that are used for food here within a local and regional and statewide and national economy, you know, versus water that gets exported to trees that are shipping nuts to Asia presently. You know, it's going to be really hard right now when we're working on a food supply chain, I think, to argue as aggressively that farm production doesn't merit water. But I think we could still all ask the question, what are the crops that are being grown and where is that food going? Especially ironically, as we are struggling right now with food insecurity in the farm worker community, in the interior of the Delta, and in the surrounding urban Delta in the EJ communities.
Thank you for that. C. Mark Rockwell asks, is X2 set at a level that is ideal for the estuary health or for water quality levels for human use in farming and M&I uses?
Yeah, that's a great question. My understanding of the
Mariah, you broke up there.
Oh, Mariah, do you want to restate the question?
Yes, I can. Is X2 set at a level that is ideal for the estuary health or for water quality levels for human use for farming and M&I uses?
X2, as I understand it, is set to benefit the estuary. It's not set with respect to human-related beneficial uses because it regulates a level of salinity, the location of a level of salinity that that is intended to help estuarine uses benefit from the salinity conditions that are optimal for their reproduction and growth. So I hope that's helpful.
But historically, it has provided a level of protection for the beneficial uses of water within the Delta, and particularly in protection for communities in the South Delta. So it just like our species laws protect water quality for Delta communities, this is an instance of proper management of the estuary benefits the people. We're not separate from protecting the estuary itself.
That's right. The productivity of the estuary is a benefit to the region as a whole.
Yes.
Great. Denise Louie asks, what is being done to increase critically needed unimpaired flows this season in the face of what appears to be a drought year?
Well, I should clarify one thing about that question. Unimpaired flows is a construct. It is an estimated flow that the board intends to regulate to. It's also used, that measure is used for other purposes as well. But now, can you restate the question for me, Mariah?
Yes, I can. What is being done to increase critically needed unimpaired flows this season in the face of what appears to be a drought year? And if I might add, there was another question similar to that by Mark Dadigan asking, what is the status of the State Water Resources Control Board required flows?
The first question is, I guess the answer that I'm aware of, and perhaps others could weigh in on the webinar with a comment or two that might further clarify things. I have not had a chance to monitor water board activities with regard to their thinking about the potential for drought. But there may be a point that comes in May when state water project and CVP allocations have been finalized, and once they know, if we just had some storms, as we all know, and the reservoirs may still fill into May, and so the exact amount of water won't be known until sometime in May, probably, for planning irrigation deliveries, and or at least for planning later irrigation season deliveries, and deliveries to other contractors that are municipal and domestic in nature.
I would also,
the second
Tim,
question. Go ahead, Barbara.
I'd also add that I would not doubt, and maybe this is speculation, but I would not doubt that if there are issues around water deliveries, that M&I water would probably take precedence in a pandemic if there have to be any cutbacks if it's a drier year. We suspect the allocations will not be full. I mean, particularly on the CVP side, it's almost virtually impossible for Westlands Water District to ever receive their full allocation. They like to, you know, complain right design in the water system, they're the last in line. So it's designed so that during a dry period, they wouldn't receive their first, their allocation. I don't, and to answer that question a little bit more directly, I don't think in drier years, we anticipate as much unimpaired flow. We're trying to go for a percentage, a fair and equitable percentage of the total. But, you know, when we hit long periods of drought, people and fish will suffer together to an extent.
Sarah Palmer has commented that at this point, state allocation is still at 15%. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thank you for that. I knew it was low. Yeah.
Hopefully it'll be increasing.
Yes. Carol Desa Campos asks, do voluntary agreements take into account long-term use of natural resources?
Well, yes, I think the short answer is yes, to an extent they do. The term of the proposed voluntary agreements that I've heard that they are working with, the term being the duration of time in which it would be, the agreements would be in effect, is 15 years. So for a definition of long-term, for many people, 15 years is a very long time. Now, if you're taking a geologic perspective, that's an extremely short period of time. And a lot of damage can happen in 15 years if proper care is not taken to ensure the protection of key beneficial uses in a place like the Delta.
Thank you. I also just want to point out that Steve Rothert has sent some comments. Secretary Babbitt was also meeting with numerous NGOs in addition to water users in 2017, and it was Governor Brown who got the negotiations started in 2017. So I believe you said that you weren't sure about the year, Barbara, either 2016 or 2017.
Year 17. Well,
yeah,
that's fine. As far as the claim of meeting with NGOs, I will point out which NGOs. Because it is never been inclusive truly of NGOs that are protective of the estuary from the Bay Area, and certainly never on a regular basis with NGOs within the Delta, and particularly with environmental justice communities tied to the health of the Bay Delta estuary. We are always left out.
Thank you. And there's one last question from Mahesh Maskey, and it says, Can we find the list of both irrigation and urban areas that supply the Folsom Reservoir operation? And if so, where can we find such information?
You may be able to find a list of the contract. There used to be a list of the contractors on the old Bureau of Reclamation Mid-Pacific Region website. They've revamped their website in recent months, and I have not been back to look at it. But if the questioner wants to check the Bureau of Reclamation's website for the Mid-Pacific region and search out the Folsom or the American River Unit or Division, the American River Division of the Central Valley Project, there may be a list of agencies there. And if the questioner has trouble, the questioner is free to give me drop me a line via email or through RTD, and I'm happy to try and help them find that list.
Okay, and I apologize. There's one last question from S. Rowe. I recall in 2009, there was a law signed by Governor Brown which mandated the unimpaired flow amounts for February 1st through June 30th. Is this true? If so, which law was that? And if it is true, it is confusing to me which entities chose to not follow the law.
I don't believe that's correct. There was a law, an important law passed in 2009 called the Delta Reform Act. It provided one of its early actions, as I recall, was to direct the state water board to prepare public trust flow criteria that were to be informational to assess how much water fish would need in the Delta to recover their populations.
Right.
And on the San Joaquin side, the State Water Board, when it completed its work, had flow criteria for the San Joaquin side of 60% of unimpaired flow, and that would operate during the season to really benefit fish. It would operate during the season February 1st through June 30th. That criterion or objective never became law. It never became a board rule. It was by law. It was considered strictly informational.
Also, let's clarify 2009, that was during the Schwarzenegger administration, the Delta Reform Act was passed.
Okay, thank you. Somebody let me know that I missed one of their questions, so they are, I believe, resubmitting it. But other than that, if anybody else would like to ask a question, our webinar is set to end at 12:30, but it might end earlier if we have no more questions. So if you do.
Mariah, is the video of this webinar going to be available?
Yes, it will be. All of this has been recorded, including all of the questions that have been answered. And if anybody would like, if they can't access the handouts for some reason, if they want to send me an email at Mariah, MARIAH, at restorethedelta.org, I can go ahead and email those to you, no problem.
You can also email us additional questions if you walk out your front steps to get a breath of fresh air and say, oh, I forgot, to yourself. We're still reachable. And then Mariah, maybe we can send the link for the video to our members so that they can watch at their leisure.
Yeah, definitely. And if anybody on this call, maybe they feels like they missed something or they have other, they want to take notes, we can go ahead and send the recording of this out to you first because it'll probably go automatically. Okay, the last question from C. Mark Rockwell, he resubmitted it. What are the rules and penalties that will mandate irrigation districts to meet their commitments in any voluntary flow obligation for a specific river?
We don't know.
Wow, that's a neat question. I like the idea. And it's one of the big concerns that we have, but I don't think that's known right now.
Yeah, we don't know. And again, we can't speculate until some point we're brought into the process and can actually see documents.
Okay, perfect. Well, that is all that we have, all of the questions that we have.
We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate the attentiveness and the support. And I want to thank Tim for pulling together a great detailed presentation, and Mariah always for being just absolutely delightful and getting us all together.
Thank you for your omnicompetence.
I appreciate it. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll get this
Yes,
recording
thank
to
you,
you as soon
everybody.
as possible.
And we wish everyone health and happiness right now. Take care.
Yes.
Yes, take care. Bye.